You are.
You heard it, folks. He's ready to go. This is Curtis Pitts, who's going to join us today in regards to the prison, the Kansas Reception Diagnostic Center out near 6th and Rice. I'm Bob Totten. I'm the executive director for the Shawnee County Historical Society. We're graced to have Curtis Pitts come here and talk to us about what happened back, I think, in the 1900s and how what we know as the women's prison on the east side of town and how it progressed. I do want to encourage those that have not joined our organization that they should. For $35, you could become a member of the Shawnee County Historical Society. The cost is $35. Send it to Post Office Box 2201, Topeka, Kansas 66601. We're really fortunate to have these programs. Thanks to Christine Steinkühler, our president. We've had various folks, as you well know, over the last 2.5 years. This is going to be recorded, so at the later date, if somebody wants to listen to this or see this again, you'll have that opportunity in the near future. But right now, we're going to talk about the prison, the vocational school, the various, various ways that had been used near 6th and Rice. And our gentleman that's going to be joining us, and he's in my picture, and hopefully you'll be able to see him also, is Curtis Pitts. And Curtis has a varied background from what I understand. He was a football player, a basketball player at Fort Hays State, but he's originally from Tampa, Florida. He was president of the Black Student Union there at Fort Hays, and he was someone that Mrs. Coretta Scott King spied and encouraged him to become involved with some of the things that she was doing. And there's some growth there too that's occurred. And more recently, he went back to Fort Hays and got his degree in 2020 after playing football and basketball out miles, as he said, 2.5 days of a bus ride to Fort Hays. Can you imagine doing that? Anyway, Curtis, it's all yours. We're really wanting to find out more about what's gone on in this area of that you're going to talk about, because I think you have a good story to talk about. All yours. Take care.
Well, I appreciate the Shawnee County Historical Society giving me an opportunity to share. And I want to say the most exciting thing about today is getting to listen and learn from you, everyone viewing as well. As he said, I'm number 9 of 10 kids growing up in South Florida in the Sarasota, Tampa area. I'm excited about the opportunity to be here. I did come to Topeka for a reason to get married and go back to Atlanta. I actually started out at Fort Hays State University, Hays, America. I played a lot of football as a freshman, and by the time I realized I wasn't a basketball player, it was too late. I'd already signed and took a 2.5-day bus drive to get to Kansas. And I love the state of Kansas because of its unique environment and history, being a history kind of guy and learning so much. You know, one of the things that I think that if you're from here, sometimes, you probably say, well, we're just another state, but in reality of it is that you guys have been trailblazers and you have a history of sacrifice and I should say, go get it attitude. One of the things I like about the school here, I want to make sure it's very clear that, of course, I'm not the expert. I'm just a lay person who's been given a task and assignment based off of working with my elders for some decades, trying to find out more about the school and why it closed. As he said, I did get to work for Mrs. King. She came to Fort Hays State, invited me back to Atlanta. I was her national youth coordinator. I went through her advanced scholars internship program, and it was very fascinating getting there and learning as much as I did about, the civil rights movement. Then she took me from the Scholars Institute program and hired me as her staff, and I worked for her. I represented SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, where I would go out and I would coordinate marches, and I was the assistant national coordinator on the 1982 march from Carrollton, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. And that was fascinating. That was when I realized that, you have to be committed to this thing. I know about the cross burnings in your front of your hotel and the Molotov cocktails and, being in a situation where you have to decide if it's really what you're about is being committed to positive change. And the one thing I learned about being in the South and growing up in an era where I always tell people in Kansas, you take so much for granted because, in my community now, when you say, where's the Black community, in Topeka, I was fascinated because when I went to what they said was the East Side, it was so mixed and beautiful. There was, you know, African Americans, German Americans, Russians, Latino Americans, Native Americans, everyone lived there. And that always fascinated me. And if you ever had an opportunity to go to the South, you truly understand the level of intensity, because I can realize, you know, now that 4 years ago, the first Caucasian person moved in my community at home in Florida. And, you know, the things that you guys did here in the state are so fascinating. And that school fascinated me. And I'll get right into why it's so important that we continue to build opportunities to have race relations improve, because I believe there's 4 pillars to our community: God, family, you know, community, and race relations. Without those 4 pillars, then our society will start to waver and ultimately we will fall. We won't be destroyed from the outside, we'll be from the inside. The way I found out about the Industrial and Educational Institute, KVS, is I was on a trip with Mr. Dale Cushenberry. And I had come to town here and I was going to play football in 1993, finish school, get married, and go back to Atlanta. He and Mr. Roy Abbott took me on a drive around town. And so one of the afternoon drives, as he was telling me about the city, he took me, of course, down 21st Street, and he thought it was the most hilarious thing. I was wondering why the elders let me sit in the front seat of the car. But I don't know if you know, coming down that hill on 21st Street, it looks like the road disappears. And so, you know, me being a petite guy, I think I almost pulled his dashboard off. Then he took me around and he showed me the area where the Deer Creek traffic way is. And then he took me over to a gentleman by the name of Mr. Edwin Train Hughes' house. And as we were talking to Mr. Hughes, we were standing in the front yard, I kept seeing Mr. Hughes stare across the street at the prison. And me thinking at that time about the prison to the school to prison pipeline, I'm like, I know it hurts him seeing all the African Americans going in and out of this prison institution. But I realized quickly that wasn't it. The thing that was so fascinating, I could see that kind of tears well up in his eyes as he started to tell me the story. He told me, I came to Kansas to go to college there. I played football and basketball there. I coached football and basketball there. I'm going, coach where? He says, that over there was a Black college. It was a historically Black college. I said, the prison? Coming from Florida, we have FAMU, we have Bethune-Cookman, we have Edward Waters, we have all of these higher education institutions that were a part of the 1890 group. It was very fascinating to me that this Brown versus the Board of Education city could let that institution close. And I took it personal and it kind of hurt my feelings, and I started asking questions. And I had a class, one of my first classes with Mrs. Deborah Dandridge. She's an archivist, one of the archivists at KU, I think in the Spencer Library. Brilliant. I started asking questions some years later about what happened. How did the college close? How did it get there? Where were the people that were there? And as I started asking questions, then from her, Mr. Hughes, you know, I didn't realize that the transition of control of the facility actually started in the late 1800s. Because in the late 1800s, the African-American community and like-minded white Americans from across the nation raised the funds to buy the property out there. Although the school, I think, actually started at about 10th and Adams as a part of Washington School that became the Boys and Girls Club and ultimately got torn down. So as he's telling me about this school, I started trying to figure out what happened. So I started going to, you know, different historical organizations, and I found out more about it, you know, that it was fascinating. It was like every other Black college in the United States. You know, they had strong academic, strong agricultural academic relationships, you know, farming, they were self-sustaining, they raised their food, they grew their livestock, and they did an amazing job of maintaining this amazing facility. And me being from the South and seeing that this being the Brown versus the Board of Education city, I wanted to know how this Black college in Kansas being the Brown versus the Board of Education city, why didn't they have a Black historical college here in this state? And as I started reading and finding out more, that I found out that the college was actually one of the first Black colleges this side of the Mississippi. And it was built in relationship with Tuskegee University. It was called Tuskegee of the West. The people from Tuskegee were intricately involved in developing the curriculum and the relationship. And in fact, one of the educators from Tuskegee actually came to Topeka to be the president of the college. And so I'm trying to find the documentation on the various names of the school. How did it transfer the property? How did it become a prison? I just wanted to know because my feelings were hurt because I knew in the South, in a more intensely segregated environment, we were able to maintain our school. But then we find out that the process actually started around the last of the 1800s, when the school became a part of the Board of Regents and the state kind of slowly took over the Board of Directors. And then in about 1910, between 1910 and 1903 to 1910, there was some sort of negotiation, or I would call a quiet hostile takeover, because at that time, African Americans did not have very much recourse as far as fighting. And then you remember the Dred Scott decision wasn't that old at that particular time. So what had happened was the state had started to take over the board and started to administer. These are my perspectives from what I've read in history. And as they took over and became the leadership of the school, they made a decision in 1955 to close the institution. And so I felt a little better. And I had been to the deed's office so many years since 1997, trying to find out what happened. And one day I walked in there at the right time, the right person was there. The Register of Deeds, Mrs. Becky Niosi. And she took me and she said, look, Curtis, let's look here, and let's look here. I'm going, wow, she's getting to this thing more than I am. And so finally she found the documents and the warranty deed. And that warranty deed said in 1910 that the state of Kansas must forevermore, basically paraphrasing, use this institution for the education of Negro children. And if it's not used for the education of Negro children, that it had to be returned to the ownership of the Black community. The thing that fascinates me so much about this thing, and I want to make this very clear about this state, this is probably one of the most important geographical areas, other than, I would say, the Holy Land itself. Because everything that you've seen in America, the fight that came from the abolitionists to free the slaves, not just in the United States, because the abolitionist movement was worldwide. Everything that you've seen, the success, the pressure, when you see white Americans moving from across the country to say, we're going to a state and we're going to draw a line in the sand and say that we're going to end this great sin of the United States, we're going to end slavery. When you walk in the state capitol and you see this giant mural of John Brown, when you read about Bleeding Kansas, when you read about the impact of the Brown case, that was later on that I consider a greater effect of the ancestral work of the Kansas who came here. When you read about Pap Singleton, who was sent down south to tell free slaves that if they came to Kansas, they could buy land, and give an opportunity to grow. And that Nicodemus community still is there now. When you find out that so many people in Oklahoma, African Americans, Black Americans in Oklahoma, Missouri, Texas, Arkansas, Colorado, they were trying to get to Kansas because there was hope and opportunity here. And I think that sometimes people take it for granted when you say integration. See, when I talk to the Board of Education, and I'm going to get to the school and why it's so important, is that Kansas actually integrated the world. In my school in Florida, they put a large portion of the Black kids in special ed because they couldn't figure out a way to deal with integrated schools. When I see about Topeka High, you had the Ramblers and you had the Trojans, but you all went to the same school. You see in 1905, you see where football players were playing on Topeka High schools of all color. Then you see in certain parts of town, you couldn't live here, you couldn't live there because of segregation. And then you see, the ultimate court case of Brown versus the Board of Education, and understanding that they had to use Brown, not just because of the letter of the alphabet, because if they would have started to work seriously in the South, in South Carolina, we'd probably have a different story. We might almost have another civil war. We take for granted so much about this city that when you look at the mascot, this is why we got to move together as a family and get this school reopened. Not because we want an institution for Black Americans, but because it's the right thing to do. When you think about the mascot of KU, I call it the only civil rights mascot in the world that's used by a higher education institution. When you think Jayhawk, you think law enforcement. I always train people that the Jayhawkers were some of the first people who went out to protect runaway slaves. One of the first and only law enforcement institutions that was created and designed to fight and protect runaway slaves, to fight against it. When they sacked Lawrence, a lot of the response was by the Jayhawkers. And me being from South Florida, don't get it wrong, I'm a Miami Hurricane all day, but you got to recognize the impact of an institution that uses a Jayhawk, and we take it so lightly and for granted. But when you're from the outside of this state and you start reading the history, you get fascinated by the fact that regardless of what we do in this state, we're forced to live up to the heritage, to who we are, regardless of how conservative, how liberal our delegation is to Washington, D.C. Our delegation led the efforts to get the African American Museum in Washington, the official apology for slavery. And you see in this state, you see things that are happening that are beyond what we believe and what we think about as a people. So when you have a college that was sitting at 6th and Rice Road, that was created by the blood and sweat equity of the Black community, we have to do our part to return that legacy, that heritage, that inheritance back to the community. Not because it's a good business model, but because it's the Kansas way. When you drive and you see that area and you realize that from 6th and Rice Road to where the Payless shoe stores were, all the way down to where Reese's is at 6th and Deer Creek Traffic Way, that was majority of that was owned by the Black community, and they farmed and they used sweat equity. There was not a dependency on government. There was a desire to prepare their kids to compete. What is the next great movement in America? When you see tribalism and everyone fighting and separating from each other, it's now a time and a season again where racism and tribalism has to be stopped, and it has to have that change come from Kansas. We have an ancestral responsibility. Blood was spilled in the land here to make that change. I told myself walking across some pastures out in western Kansas near Nicodemus, near 36 Highway, and I said, wow, I couldn't imagine telling my family we're going out west to do the right thing for those less fortunate. And you telling me that gentleman that wrote that document in 1910, he knew in 1910 that he did not have a way to stand up against the system, because all they had to do was eliminate or just reject any efforts by the Black Americans to keep their property or just kill them. So those people who cared, like most Kansans do, they put it in the document because they knew there'd be a time and a day where we'd be able to right an injustice. That's why we're still here. That's the season that we're in now. That's the great movement that we're required to do as people in this Kansas who have a voice. It doesn't fall down party lines. It falls down to who you are as Kansans. He knew in 1910 there would be a time where we could use the courts, the legislature, the leadership, the executive branch, and say, we must correct this injustice. We're not saying giving them a handout. We're saying giving them something that they built and they sweated for. When you don't know your history and your culture and your value, and something sitting right here becomes a prison, then we're saying to a generation that we're going to create an orphan environment, a hopeless environment. This school is not in my natural wheelhouse, but working with Mr. Thomas Steele, Mr. Vernon Steele Sr., with Pam Kohler, Michelle Watson, Mr. Roy Abbott, you know, I could go on. And I say this to you again, I get to walk into it and stand at the feet of my ancestors, Black and white. I got to meet Miss Linda Brown on so many occasions. I was so amazed at how kind and humble she was. When you hear from Cheryl Brown, you find about the kindness and commitment from their families. When you hear from people like Mrs. Pamela Johnson Betts, whose father went to the school, and you can see the pride and what they built, and you see the generational success. Where do we go from here? We've been passing out information and lobbying at the state legislature. We're hoping that they'll introduce something this year to return the property back to us. And we understand to build a new prison, it costs $300 million. And we're not telling Kansas that you have to take a $300 million hit to return some property to a people that it belonged to. We're not going to pay less and say return our land, or I-70, part of your highways running through that land that they have. What we're saying is How do we create a win-win for the people of Kansas? How do we set the next stone in place? Because America needs these types of victories right now. We assume, and people are feeding on our ability not to know and understand each other. I talked to a crowd in the South, and they were so amazed when I asked them one question. I said these simple words. I just wanted to see all these intellects in this room. I said, when I say this, I want you guys to respond and finish it for me. I said, he. Everybody in the room said, ha, ha. I said, there was a time when we all were country and western. We all listened and watched hee haw. We knew what Minnie Pearl was going to wear. We knew there would be an African-American in the crowd somewhere easing it into. I know what it's like to go to a conference at the Grand Ole Opry. I know what it's like to go to the backwoods of Alabama in the 80s and realize that it hasn't really changed. I know what it's like to have Molotov cocktails thrown at you. But for whatever reason, when they were burning down Black Wall Street in Tulsa, way out in western Kansas, Nicodemus survived. When I visited Nicodemus, and I'm finding people that went to school, went to live in White City, Waukene, Phillipsburg, they were all at Fort Hays State, and how they had friends that lived in Nicodemus. When I talked to Verl Schweitzer, and they talked about farming and living out there. And I'm fascinated because those had to be some strong African-American people who withstood that. But at the same time, there had to be some strong white Americans that said, we are Kansans, and we have spilled blood for the betterment of our nation. When you have a civil war that starts in one state before it becomes a national thing, then you know that you're in a very powerfully spiritual, important place. And how do we start the healing America again? It has to start in Kansas. And I say this to you again, we're not asking Kansas to take a $300 million hit and build a new prison. We're saying there's other opportunities that are close to us, but those original buildings, we need to have access to those. Those are an inheritance of a community that had nothing. It was a symbol. The other Black college was on Quindaro Street in Kansas City, Kansas. They were here before many of the Black colleges in the South. It was called Western University. But here at 6th and Rice Road in East Topeka, the thing that became the prison where every prisoner had to go to the diagnostic center. They called it Candyland when I got to town. You had to go there to get an evaluation to see what prison you'd go to and what level of incarceration, the institution that you would be dwelling in. This was a Black college. And I'm in Washington, D.C. presenting at a conference, and the head of the National Roundtable, which was the National Association of Black Parks and Recreation staff and members from across the country, he told me about graduating from Kansas Tech, the Industrial Education Institution of Topeka, and having to go to KU to get his transcripts. Because right now, KU is the keeper of records for all of those graduates of that school, because in the 80s, they had to send to KU to get their transcript from that college at 6th and Rice Road to go to higher education institutions across the nation. So how can we let that not happen in this time, in this season, when we're all like-minded people? And we ask as you join this battle, because we have to do this as a family. We don't have an opportunity. This isn't a segregationist move again. This isn't a movement of what I would call the popular dialogue. This is a movement of the Kansas way. How can we look back at our ancestors who in the season and the time when no one would accept Black Americans, when this process of starting this school started right after statehood for the state, not fight in the season to return it? I have not met one legislator on either side of the aisle, either party, who's not given me an amazingly positive response. And they wanted to know why and how. And my question for you is, why and how? Are you willing to just make this an entertainment part of your week, or are you willing to make a commitment to the change necessary? Are you willing to take on the fight that your ancestors bled and died for? Both sides of it. Are you willing to stand and watch and we lose the very thing that our statehood was founded on. Runaway slaves came to Kansas, went to Western Kansas. And I know me riding on a bus, riding from, and let me tell you something hilarious. My brother routed my trip. So he routed me from, this is how the trip went. I went to St. Louis from Florida, down to Houston, back up to Kansas City, then across Kansas for 2.5 days. I'm on this bus. And I'm gonna tell you something fascinating about that trip that I learned. If you don't watch closely, if you don't understand the vision, if you don't understand the streets, the ground, the trees, and the skies, what they say to you, if you know the story, because they speak to you, because I'm riding on the bus, I'm like, there's nothing here. In every city I stop in, they'd be like, you don't want to go to Kansas. They're so racist out there. You don't want to go to Kansas. You know, I'd meet coaches because they'd all come to Florida to recruit you. And every bus stop you went to, there was a bunch of coaches in there picking up players. And they'd be like, in Tennessee, they'd be like, Curtis Pitts? Yeah, you're supposed to come with them. No, I'm going to Fort Hays State. You know, you get to Missouri. Oh yeah, Curtis Pitts, you're supposed to come with us. Illinois, Georgia, Kentucky. Then you get to Kansas City, Kansas, and like, okay, this is cool. All right, big city. Then you, in between Kansas City, Kansas, and Lawrence, there was nothing. Between Lawrence and Topeka, there was nothing. And I won't tell you about how I felt when I left Topeka going out west. But I didn't understand the impact of who you were at the heart of this thing. You cannot afford not to join into this, not battle, not fight, movement to the restoration of part of the Kansas family. You need to join this movement to restore an inadequately supported part of the family. Why is it necessary? It's who you are. If in the 1800s they can start a Black college before, listen, even before the land grants of 1890 that started most of the Black colleges across the country, Kansas was already on its way. When you had Lincoln University that was integrated from day one. Are you telling me that we can afford to bypass this part of history and our children don't need to understand who we are at our very core? So what we have going now is simple. We're working and talking to the legislators, and we're asking you to call and talk to your legislators. We're asking you to reach out to everyone you can and say, we want to support this movement for the restoration of part of our family that's not being served at this particular time. Are we trying to open a college just for Black people? No, that's not the Kansas way. Even the college itself was not segregated. And one of the things I learned in my middle school going to this school where we had race riots was that poverty doesn't have a color. And when you study history, the sharecroppers and the poorest people were in the Klan. The people who made the decisions were in the citizens group. It was a little different here in Kansas where the citizens group said that we're going to be opening Washburn, Lincoln University. And we're going to open this Black college. Just like we're going to draw a line in the sand and say, we cannot afford to have slavery destroy our opportunity to get to heaven. We were not enslaved, one of God's creations. This movement is not about Curtis Pitts' view, his philosophy, because it's not in my natural wheelhouse. But when you get amazing people around you that are saying, Curtis, we need to do this, I support you. Because in the whole group of people, you think about it, as blonde as my hair is, I'm still the kid in the bunch. I try not to make decisions on my own. I try not to not move in the way that our ancestors would be excited about it. And the thing I learned about being at the King Center, and I learned about Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence, you have to have a win-win situation. And see, in our world, they want us to fight like children, where we say, it's my ball and I'm taking it home and nobody else gets to play with it. But in this day and time, Kansas has to make a powerful move in a statement to the rest of the world that we can heal. Whether you're Democrat or Republican, it does not matter. We must heal. And this school is a symbol of that change, that opportunity, that restoration. Can you afford to watch? No, you cannot. If they say no, we got to come back with another plan. If they say no, we're not going to say, oh, it's racism, we're going to come back with another plan. If it becomes another legal issue, then it becomes a legal issue. But it's not us against them. It's a decision that has to be made for the restoration and the completion of this mission that we call the Kansas Way. Imagine come across this country, probably 2 winters to get to Kansas, this territory, to say, before we do anything, we will end slavery and we will not take advantage of God's creations. That's who we are at the core. That's what I learned the Kansas Way is. That's what I learned when my son went to Our Lady of Guadalupe and then to Hayden. We were so poor, it was our day to make food for the football team. And I'm telling you the story because I want you to understand why I believe in you being an outsider who's been here for 40 years. This is my 40th year anniversary of doing programs and activities in this city. I knew I was in the right place after all these years because my son was a senior and it was his turn to make food for the football team at Hayden. And you have to have this great meal before the game on Saturday night, this fellowship interaction, families get involved. So I'm this guy who was not taught to go around and ask for a lot of things. So I'm trying to figure it out. And those same ladies from my community in East Topeka, those impoverished ladies, those ladies from Our Lady of Guadalupe that became his surrogate parent, those parents from Hayden High School. By the time I got back trying to figure out how to get the food together, they were all in there together, had put the food together and were preparing to serve it. That's the Kansas Way. You have a responsibility, like I do, to pass the torch. When you go to the Brown Museum and you see the video about the relay, it's all of our turn now to run. We see right now that the next generation is wavering. They don't know who they are. They're trying to figure out what their place is and what our nation's really about because we're not communicating. They can't see the line. They can't see who's turning the corner and who's turned those corners before them to make this state and this nation what it is. We cannot be the moral compass of the world until Kansas steps back into its rightful place as the team builder, the healer, the trailblazer, the change agent, not just a change agent, but an agent for positive change. So as we're going to the legislature, call your legislator. Whether you've lived here and you don't live here anymore and you're calling from out of town, whatever city you used to live in Kansas, call them. If you've never been active in politics, realize this isn't a political move. This is a change. This is a healing process. This is a time where we have to say, who are we as a nation? And no one can answer that question until it's answered in Kansas. That's how it always starts. Who would think that a Jayhawker was on the side of an anti-slavery movement when all over the nation there were slave hunters and got a bounty, got paid to return slaves to their masters in the South? Who would think that a school would have a mascot and they sing a song, Rock, Chalk, Jayhawk, KU? Don't get me wrong, I'm a Fort Hays man, go Tigers. I love Washburn. But that chant, that way of life, it's not a passing thought. It's who you are at the core. It's what this ground is. It's in the soul. It's in the sun. It's in the sky. It's in the clouds. It's in the ancestry. It's in the history. And the story has to be told. I'm going to say it as they say in the South. The idea that we're moving like we are in this state is a knee-high belly whopper. We just don't understand the impact of who we are. And I have never been in a place where a delegation was supposed to be so conservative, trickled in with some people who were so liberal, are the point people with John Lewis in Atlanta talking about let's get the museum built in Washington. And they all voted for the Juneteenth holiday. And I say to you all, as we get ready, and I ask you to join us, and I'll send out some information, about our Juneteenth celebration. Do you know that without Kansas and their efforts, bleeding Kansas, the abolitionist movement, there would not be a Juneteenth? Think about where you are and what you're doing. This is not a battle. This is not a fight. This is a movement for positive change and restoration of this great, amazing state. Been here so long, my family like to tell me that you've been out here too long, you're a Kansan now. I'm like, well, I'm a Floridian. No, you're a Kansan. But the truth of it is, it's an honor to be called in Kansas. When you look at the root of this thing, when you look at a Pap Singleton bringing freed and runaway slaves to Kansas. When I was reading about Mr. Bill Wagner and Joan Wagner and all of you guys' effort to open the Ritchie House, I've been here for a while. I remember the different arguments about everything, but I saw the intent, the intent to be pure about where it at and what's happening. And you guys have held fast to those beliefs and what you're about. This Zoom meeting today is not just a fundraiser. It's an opportunity to be a part of the last and the first great battle of our nation. Who are we? Are we the trailblazers? Because if Kansas falls, so does the nation. Because there is no one else that has the history, the commitment, the ancestral inheritance of this fight against separation and segregation. From the Dred Scott decision to the Brown decision, you got to realize you're the point people. You got to realize you have to engage in this movement for positive change with us. You have to own up to the fact that when you have a Shawnee County Historical Society, it should be booming and blossoming and should have no financial worries. Because it is who we are, and our children need to understand that with blood, sweat, and tears spilled on this land. It's not a hangout. It's not an option to visit it. It's a necessity. If every kid in Shawnee County isn't visiting the Historical Society and the Brown Museum, then we're failing as a society. I want to make that clear. The Ritchie House has to be a part of the curriculum for graduation from 501, Washburn Rural, Shawnee Heights, Hayden, Seaman School District. If it's not a part of the curriculum, then we were contributing to tribalism. And that's who I am, as a young man who had nothing. And I can tell you when I had nothing, I was still fighting and digging. And I watched great people like I said, Miss Deborah Dandridge, who knows more about history and the African-American struggle and victories and losses than anyone you'll ever meet. And she's right here, still living in the same community in East Topeka. So I say to you again, please join us as we press to reopen this school, to return as much of that property as we possibly can to the community that sweated and built. It's not a donation. It's not a favor. It's an inheritance that somebody who knew in 1910 that they did not have the ability to fight and resist, but he knew one day Kansas would be back to itself again, and they returned that property to the Black community. And I thank you for an opportunity to share. But don't get lackadaisical at this Kansas, the Shawnee County Historical Society. You are a part of the foundation of this community. You should be giving. You should demand that our kids go in there because our history is founded on that. And how can they go somewhere else? It's like the mayor from New York. He had the nerve to comment about Topeka, Kansas, when in reality, they're all benefiting from Topeka, Kansas. I thank you. And I look forward to answering any questions. And if I see your picture, if you don't ask me a question, I'm asking you one anyway. And I thank you again for all of our ancestors and all those people, Ms. Dandridge, Mr. Cushenberry, Mr. Alexander, Mr. Abbott, and so many more, Mr. Fidel Adelaline, so many people, Mr. Bullocks, so many people, Ms. Russell, Ms. Lena Russell, who passed away, Mr. Thomas Steele, who passed away, Mr. Edwin Train Hughes, who passed away, and so many more that gave me the information to fight this fight while I'm still here to breathe a breath. Thank you again for inviting me, Shawnee County Historical Society.
Curtis, thank you very much for being here. We do have some questions already. One was, how did this college go to being a vocational school to a prison? I mean, you've referenced, I think, 1905 or maybe 1910.
Mhm.
Somebody decided, let's go away from this. And do you know that information? And also, Deborah is on our phone Zoom today. So Deborah Dandridge is with us. So go ahead.
I'll give you, and I will tell you this much: if I don't have it correct, she can.
Yeah, no,
correct
she'll
me.
correct you, I'm sure.
She's brilliant, and I will get a lecture if I do anything wrong, and I'm not. That's the reason I'm going to make sure I had a tie on today, because she's not going to accept anything that is not, unless it's exceptional. That's how she is.
Saying you needed your coat too. Go ahead.
Exactly. You know, I'm in my house, Mrs. Andrews, so I'm trying to be as casual as I can. But from what I've read from the history, that the region started to take it over right about the turn of the century. The property was actually finalized, I think, bought about 1903. Then in 1910, that's when the warranty deed and the contract was signed with the state of Kansas. And from that point, the state of Kansas was able to add a lot of people to the board of directors of the college. Then in 1955, most of the Black colleges that you see across the country, if you've ever seen that movie Drumline, that's usually at a Black college football game. That's a part of the pageantry and the academic expectations, where you see the fun part, but the curriculum that they have is very demanding academically. But as 1910 went, the school was still going. They had football teams, basketball teams, they had co-ed, they had nursing. All of the Black businesses flourished from that school. But in 1955, as a part of the Brown case, they decided to close the school. And I think at that particular time, it was a part of the Regent system, because the Regent still has the records right now. From 1910, the state started to move more and more into take control of the board. Then in 1955, the Black community didn't have enough say-so or power at that particular time to really say, don't close the school. So they closed the school because they had Carr Area Technical School.
So that's what my next question was. The African Americans who went to this vocational school were filtered into Kaw Valley Voctech, or whatever the predecessor of that organization was.
Well, can I correct one thing though?
Please do.
One thing you had to say, they're doing an amazingly better job of recruiting now, when they built the Washburn Tech at 21st and Washburn. Yeah. But if you go and look at the numbers of Carr Area Tech from before there, the last few directors and Washburn engagement, you find that probably about 80% of the kids come from out of Shawnee County and out of Topeka.
Okay, that's true. And I've got a grandson that's also out of Osage County going to Kaw Valley Tech, or what is now Washburn Tech. Excuse me, I'm showing too much age. But you're saying it was a vocational school per se up until 1955?
It was yes, until 1955 it was what we would call it was a Black college, but to satisfy and feed the people here, you know, it was a vocational school because it did have liberal arts as well.
It didn't necessarily grant BAs and PhDs and that sort of thing, but it was a typical vocational school, which you could obviously, employment was a goal, you know, practical employment rather than academic focus of teaching and that sort of thing. Although teaching was a part of the curriculum as time went on. So, you know, that makes a difference too.
How many folks were taught? I mean, are we talking 50? Are we talking 500? Do you happen to know? Anybody? Deborah?
No, I don't. It's just that it was a very, you know, when I look at the pictures and things, you know, Curtis has done more research on this than I, but it has certainly, you know, their graduating classes were 50 to 70 to 100. So that was also the only place where Black teachers were able to be hired in 501, because you had to have a previous experience in teaching in a school. So that was a major area too, where African Americans, not only from Topeka, but from small towns, would first try to get a position there and then move on to 501.
Okay.
And remember, there weren't other Black colleges in the region at that particular time. There wasn't like a Langston or a Lincoln. So people came here from, like Mr. Hughes did, who was one of our pillars. They came here to go to that college. That was going to college for Black Americans.
Right, but Western University went down in the 30s.
Mhm.
Was really the initial one in the state of Kansas.
Does anybody else have any questions that,
Yeah, say that again.
Go ahead,
What
Diana.
college? Say that college name again.
Western University in Kansas City, Kansas.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, yes, ma'am. Yeah, that came under, gosh, I'm forgetting his name, but that too had a strong link to Booker T. Washington. So it was very much a very prominent university. It became well known for its graduates in the field of music, as well as the ministry and the arts and their other areas as well.
So what was the name of the school here in Topeka?
It had several names, and the one that we most commonly used was Kansas Vocational School. So it had several names starting out, because when it's out, you know, it was just it was a sideline of two of the teachers. Am I not right on that, Curtis? Of some of the teachers, and some of the teachers, two teachers, a male and a female, who were part of Washington School, my elementary school, and they began that area. Okay.
And when did it become a prison?
I think it actually became, I think it might have been in the early 80s, am I correct? Or maybe 70s, I'm sorry. I have to get that
I think it
information
became
back.
KRDC in the late 70s, 75, 76, from something I read on the Kansas State Historical Society website in the last 24 hours. So I think it was late 70s. Now, what it was before that, 1961, there's also a date there in 61 that something happened. I probably should have written it down or kept it more involved. 1961 was a date also.
And that was one of the things that I saw as I was researching it and going through the court documents. You know, there were various information that the changes as the regions got involved, but we know that in approximately 1903, the land was being purchased. In 1910, that's when the contract was drawn with the state of Kansas and the regions. And it was called the Industrial and Educational Institute of Topeka. Those are the documents that binded it to the Black community, because that was the agreement that they signed with the original institution, the Industrial and Educational Institute of Topeka.
So one of the questions I think is an excellent one is asking, what are some of the solutions to correct this wrong? What are you advocating?
Well, one of the things that I think is essential is that we have to reopen this institute, and we have to open it with the support, because we're not asking the state to, again, pay $300 million to open up and return the property to us, but we are asking the state of Kansas to introduce legislation that will return the original buildings to us, that will make whole the ability to offer educational programs. And we're not trying to create an institution that's going to be in competition with our four-year institutions, because we want to create an institution of higher learning that our kids and most impoverished kids get a stepping stone into higher learning. You know, we can partner with, of course, Fort Hays Go Tigers, KU, K-State, because we want to have a strong farming curriculum, urban farming curriculum. And we want to be able to constantly educate all citizens on the great, how can I say, contributions of all races. Because one of the things that I'm finding in this day and time is that we don't take enough time to appreciate each other's culture and history. But we want to make sure that we're asking the state to invest money back to make the institution as whole as possible, looking for a win-win situation in partnership with the state of Kansas. We're looking, and we plan to open up a higher learning institution that will bring many of these kids who are not getting into the other institutions for a lack of confidence, not the aptitude. They have the aptitude, but they're not exactly sure if they really belong. But we want to give them an opportunity to learn and prepare them to move on, whether it be going from a 2-year to a 4-year institution and on to up the higher level, higher learning ladder to success, because in my world, faith and education are the only real ways of getting out of poverty. And I think that anything that we do beyond asking the state to return property, to partner with others so that we don't have to pay $300 million for a new prison, but have access to the old prisons, old buildings, original ones. Excuse me. Because we do plan to offer classes and open up that institution again in some form.
So who owned it? Another question. I'm just
because I can't see the questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. But so am I taking over? Mr. Toten, am I taking
No, you're doing fine. I don't mind
Amazing.
at all. This
I'm
is
glad to
this
hear
is a
that.
free flowing.
But-
It's not, it honestly has never been, although we've kind of been pretty structured in a sense. This is open forum. I mean,
Mhm.
treat people nicely and be respectful, but shoot, ask questions. And if you have something that comes up to you that we're not addressing or haven't addressed, we should talk about it. Please do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so who owned it before it was transferred to the state?
It belonged to a group of Black churches and community members.
Primarily the Baptist church?
Correct. I think
Okay.
some help from the Methodists as well.
Oh, I know, but primarily it was in the hands of the Baptist church.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
The regional one, whatever regional organization they had at that time.
They all contributed money.
Right.
They did
They
a fundraising
pledged.
event for the school. Yes, ma'am.
Right. Mhm.
Deborah, do you happen to know there's I want to call it a retreat area that's owned or was owned by the Methodist Church that's north of Reesers, east of Carnahan, and west of
Forest Park.
Forest Park, excuse me, I don't recall the name. I wondered if there was some hook, or the reason the Methodists end up with that land was because of their prior association or whatever back in the 1900s. I mean, I'm just speculating, who knows?
That's a beautiful area.
It is when you go back and hide and
Mhm.
get involved in that. It's very pretty.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and I agree. That's a good point, because the Methodist churches and some of the others always had supported a lot of these schools and a variety of other activities for the trade schools, for vocational schools for African Americans.
And the key thing again is it became a reality as we're growing into our statehood. And it was just amazing that it was kind of the forerunner to many of the schools that are in the South. You know, when Tuskegee became a partner and wanted to be a part of it, I can see why, you know, this state never ceases to amaze me, because I didn't know that George Washington Carver went to school in the state of Kansas. This place never ceases to amaze me, never.
So what are the buildings being used for now?
They are being used now for the women's prison. And it's the only women's prison that we have in the state of Kansas. And it's going to be a good partnership to figure out how we're going to work this out together as a Kansas family. And they also have a job training, a factory building there that hires some of the inmates. But the key thing of it is there's plenty of land and plenty of opportunity for us to create a partnership that will allow the community to be made whole, and that we can get a win-win for all Kansas citizens. And we have submitted a proposal to the legislature.
What is that, Ben? What is your proposal?
Is that we would get part of the land back to start operating the facility, create training programs, and to also that we would have first right to the buildings once the state of Kansas builds a new prison facility, and or to open one, to open and use those facility on site, or to move those facilities to the area close that's not far from them where we'd like to purchase land at. But we want to look for a win-win situation, but we cannot let this go gently into that good night without a fight, because it's essential to who we are.
Who is the we?
we have put together a very, very outstanding board of people from across Kansas and across the nation. And we're really talking about core leadership in the Black community who have a legacy and a right to call themselves the ancestors of those who were participants or family members of former industrial and educational institute families.
What are you calling yourself? What is that group called?
It's called the Industrial and Educational Institute Committee Incorporated.
Mr. Pitts?
Yes.
I mean, my name's Breck Eads, and I was employed I was the medical site director at the Topeka Correctional Facility for Women from 2009 to 2017. And as the medical site director, I'm a retired physician now. But being on those grounds, I know that currently the most majestic of those structures, the limestone building that's the most prominent, is currently being used as, well, it has multiple functions. The primary function is it's being used as a dormitory for maximum security. If you show that map that you have, the facilities to the, there's a separate campus for the minimum security part of the prison. And but the most majestic structure that you're showing there, which I think is, now I don't know how many buildings still remain from the vocational institution. When I came, I was told that it at one time had been an historically Black vocational institution, that it had that in the history. But that building is also used for intake and oh, I'm blanking on the full term, the diagnostic intake. And I think the library is also in that larger building. And also there was a small nurses clinic, which was kind of a triage area for maximum security inmates. In looking at your talk, I was interested, there was a mention of the school to jail pipeline. And I think that, is that part of your concern also, that this historically Black, and as you say, the roots of Kansas involved in this, that now that it's become a prison, it's become almost an additional insult to the loss of the institution.
Absolutely.
Can you say a little bit about how that might, I think you've been very informative on this. I think a lot of people in present day Topeka are probably unaware of that connection.
Well, if I may, that's an excellent question. One of the things that we're facing across the nation is that for whatever reason that we're seeing that our high schools have created an environment where we're not preparing our young people, in particular in the Black community, to be competitive and to be prepared to work and be contributing parts of society. If you look at all of my programs since 1983, 70% of it has been academic based, because we know that without academics and being prepared to compete, then you're going to have a hard time going from the welfare rolls to the tax rolls. And I'll give you an example. When you see now that we're spending so much time on culture, where you'll see that great debate is based off of, when you had the college here in town, there were more Black businesses than we've ever had. And if you have Black businesses, then Black businesses can not only hire African Americans and others, but also train their children to be contributing parts of society. Wherein for a long time across the nation, they were warehousing children without any real understanding when the root cause of this thing was because we basically all had the same value and culture and faith system, but because we wanted to do, I call it social engineering, but people think of that term differently. We're spending a lot of time not focusing in on the education and preparation to be competitive, be job business owners, and not just employees. So you're seeing a desire where single family households are becoming the norm rather than two-parent households. And that causes the ability for that child to be trained in social behavior prior to going to school, to be trained and have an acceptable understanding of the value and culture of where they come from. Because right now in our society, I'm just going to be very blunt, we're not preparing African-American children in particular to be competitive, to be business owners, to be, when I came along, they tried to tell us that sports was our only way out. And then working for my daddy, because he told me, he said, son, there is no job that any man can have, and particularly a Black man, that can help him pay for 10 children. And so we're creating an environment where we're focusing too much on everything but the education of the most impoverished people in our society. Every year that the impoverished group starts out, but in the end, it's usually the Black community that's always on the bottom of that ladder. And I don't say that I don't always call it racism. I call it the inability to remember when everybody was pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and African Americans played a very powerful role in the building of this nation, even when we had to do it for free. But the history of the thing says academics, valuing your history and culture, because like I always tell people, it's okay to have a German club. It's okay to have a Native American club, an Irish, any club that talks about a people's race and culture and what they contributed. And when we think about welfare, we take that welfare and we say, and I'm taking a long time, but I want to say this, I'm trying to hit you with as much as I can. When people think of welfare, they think about impoverished minority people getting money. But if you travel the state of Kansas, some of the biggest DCF SRS offices are in counties where there are no African Americans and very few Latinos. Poverty doesn't have a color. And when you think of welfare and you think of this school, welfare was actually created for the railroads. It's for the welfare of this nation to give the railroads free land so that they can build across the nation. So when we don't know the history and the kids don't know the history, they get influenced by other things. And we're not going back to the time where reading and writing and mathematics and science are valued as much as they should be, because we need to get to the core curriculum of this thing and understand the true value and history. Because if everybody's going to visit, so many African-American fathers at that time, back in the 80s when I first came here, at the diagnostic center, this Black college, and not even know it's a Black college, then it's a travesty. When I went to speak out there in the 90s, I could see the Masonic cornerstones. I could see a few benches that had the Black fraternal organizations' names carved in them. So there's so much right here that does not meet the eye that these kids can have pride in, that their ancestors used sweat equity to build something that was going to move them and this nation forward. And that's what's happening all over the country. We're not valuing the hard work and sweat equity of all Americans. And so it's creating tribalism, and it's creating a chattel and a population of people who are like, their value only comes in, probation, law enforcement, court system. They're almost like they're constantly being forced in this system. And don't get me wrong, I'm a great respecter of law enforcement and all of those people that serve in our military, but we have to give these young people the true history that our people are designed and have been hard workers and help build this nation. And I don't know if I answered your question, but that prison in the pipeline is fed because of that very, very particular reason. They don't value who they are because their past is not valued. Not saying it should be valued over others, but we need to tell them that hard work and education was what made our nation and our particular people advance into who we are today. I know
that pretty much answers my question. And then another comment I have, this is more a comment than a question. No, I guess it is a question, but I could see, now you've talked about it becoming an educational institution. I'm not sure whether you're talking about it becoming a tertiary education, such as like a community college, or whether it become a vocational college, vocational school,
No.
or possibly a preparatory school. So still in the secondary, but a
Yes.
preparatory school that would look towards directing, as you said, poverty knows no color, but those that might not otherwise have, be placed on a path towards success instead of a path towards incarceration.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
And I think, I'm hoping
So
you guys
what
know that I'm
level?
enjoying learning from you guys as well. And thank you.
So what level? He asked what level? Are they talking about secondary or vocational or?
We would talk vocational and a how would we say vocational and a general studies environment with focuses on CMA, CNA, law enforcement, and urban farming. So we were hoping to go all the way up to a 2-year institution, junior college, but we also want to provide pre-K through 12th grade college preparatory programs and curriculum for those kids, so that they need to understand. I had to understand that you can't go to
You
college.
can't do both. I
Yeah.
don't think you can do both at the same
Pardon me?
time. I don't think you can do K through 12 and 2 years college and vocational all at the same time.
Well, the reason that you can do it is because we do it now. Every program that we offer has a pre-K through 12 curriculum where we're introducing to the kids of the concept that you can go on to higher education, you can go into vocational school, you can go to a junior college, because Kansas has a plethora of institutions of higher learning. But you have to start early telling them. It's not so much that you spend all day in a classroom there, but you have to start offering programs that introduce them to the higher learning environment. Because if you go to Washburn right now, you go to Emporia State, you'll meet so many of my kids, at KU, Wichita State, whose family, they're first generational college students. And like, I didn't understand when I was a kid. I give you a prime example. I was walking around with a box of letters from colleges, and I was asking why no colleges had offered me a scholarship yet. And I keep getting all these letters from the guy. I had to go to the undertaker in the community, who was the most educated. And he starts laughing at me. And he goes, "These are scholarships offers." And I'm going, "Oh, okay." And he started explaining it to me. And my coach could have said the exact same thing to me, but I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that in front of the coach. And so once you learn, all of the kids that after I wound up graduating from this Catholic high school, and everybody was going to, Juilliard, Princeton, all of the Ivy League schools, many of the best schools, Stanford, Chicago University, Loyola University. And, they gave me the impression that my lot was tied to my athletic ability. But if I had a curriculum that told me that there was other options, Gear Up, the TRIO program, I'll be very honest, if I knew those programs existed, I would have never played college football a day in my life. But when you create and it's instilled in you in an early age, my family was so poor that the project kids called us poor. But we always knew there was a FAMU and a Bethune-Cookman, and we wanted to go there. We just didn't know how to get there. And that's the type of program we're talking about when we talk about a pre-K through 12 curriculum, where they're getting introduced to the higher learning. And I can tell you now, my brothers own construction companies, and I'm the youngest brother, and I use that all the time. They make more money than I'll ever make. And so there's nothing wrong with going to college and getting a vocational degree and getting the skill. And because that's a very, very, very livable income that you can have. And that's what our community is dealing with right now. How do we get to a livable income? But we're not saying necessarily create a pre-K through 12 school, but we do have to have opportunities where we're teaching them how to get to college, what's available, what classes to take. Right now, it took me 20 years to get 501 in kids to understand that not only is your grade point average, but there's certain core curriculum that you have to pass to get accepted into a Division I and Division II institution. Because right now, we're feeding our kids into an educational system. They wind up with great grades, but is it NCAA qualified? Is it preparing you? Because all of my programs and my classes, you know what we study at an early age in my class? Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And the reason that we do that is because we have to learn the language of success. The same thing I had to do with the ESL program when I asked Mr. Cushenberry to move it from Topeka High to Highland Park. It was not the aptitude that was the problem, it was the language that was the problem. And we don't know the language of success, because all across the world, English is the language of success. But if you don't know those terminologies and those phrases when you take the ACT and SAT test, it's almost like taking a foreign language. So you prepare them early through that pre-K through 12 curriculum. What is the success? What is the hierarchy of needs?
So when you say my kids, my program, you're running programs now? What are
Yes, ma'am.
those?
Yes, ma'am.
You haven't mentioned, you said my programs, but what are they? Where are they? And what are they called?
Most of my program is what we call the Prosperity Academy. You know, I run after school programs, I run summer leadership programs. I've been doing it for the last 30 years. And I didn't bring those up because I'm asked to talk about the school. And I've had thousands of kids come through my program over the years because we never charge. And we provide a meal and a lunch, but they had to take the academic part of it, the educational part of it, before they could do the recreational part of it. We run them from any parts of the city that you can believe in. Some of them, like last summer, how can I say, we're using the Khan Academy as our core for our academic support, where it's online, probably one of the best online educational support systems I've ever seen, and it's free. But if you go to our website, that's NAAAUSA.com, that's NAAAUSA.com. We have a partnership with Kansas State University, the College of Agriculture. And we bring our kids up there every summer for training. I put on conferences there. And I've been doing it for decades because I know what it's like. And I'm saying this to everyone on the screen. If the Black community, the white community were supportive in my educational endeavors and my growth, even here in Topeka. So we have to create environments where everyone's valued in the curriculum. And that's what
we agree.
NAAAUSA.com. That's NAAAUSA.com.
Question you haven't addressed, you don't see, is has there been a legal challenge related to the guarantee clause in the contract that transferred the school's land to the Board of Regents?
There has not been a legal
on that myself, but go.
In 1993, the state of Kansas, I think you have to excuse me, I'm a layperson, I'm not an attorney. I think it's a summons and alias and summons, trying to say that they wanted to find out if there was any of the ancestors or stakeholders who were there. They ran it, and of course the Metro News at that particular time, and some of the ancestors were actually working for the state. And so at that time, the state of Kansas assumed actual ownership of the property because they knew until they did that process, they couldn't own the land, which I thought was very, very unfair. And I was very, disappointed that they did it in 1993. But if I believe that from what we're receiving and getting from the attorneys who want to volunteer to work the case, that they think that we have a great opportunity to win. And that's a process that, I think should be the last thing that we should ever do. But I do believe that I think the state will come in and partner with us and have a win-win situation, but the issue has to be pressed. You cannot, if it has become a legal battle, it's not that we're going to become enemies, it's just that has to be fought, and we'll all grow and learn for the betterment of it, from the betterment of it.
Any other questions, folks? Curtis, I don't see any. I'm sure that you have an email address that you've given me. And if anybody else has questions, you can sure ferret those to me and then I can pass them on to you.
Awesome.
We have all appreciated you taking time to be with us and understand this a little better than what we've had in the past. At least I know I've learned some things, so that's always probably indicative of at least 10% of the people on our call. Any other questions before we close this down? If not, if you joined us late, I hope to have this recorded. It is recorded. I hope to have it on our website oh, probably another day and a half. It takes a while to turn it around, but I do appreciate that. We do have programs coming up in 2 weeks. We'll have Linda Brown's sister, Cheryl Brown Henderson, is going to be our guest. Next week, we have Show and Tell, and it will not be a Zoom meeting. It will be here at 1118 Southeast Madison. At least that's the last I know, where people will bring in historic items or what they think are historic items, and we have a group of folks that will discern, or at least hopefully discern, what that really means and what it has to do with Topeka history. That'll be at 3 o'clock here on Sunday next week, March 12th. Appreciate all of you who have participated today. And Mr. Pitts, again, thank you for your time and efforts to do that also. We'll see you next week at 3 o'clock. Have a good afternoon.